Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with lead strength and conditioning coach at the Irish Institute of Sport, Eamonn Flanagan. Thanks for tuning in to episode 99 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. So in my head, I've got a big build up to episode 100, but this definitely, as number 99, could have been episode 100 with Eamonn Flanagan. So in this chat, we discuss RSI and velocity-based training as our two main topics, and we dive a little bit deeper into, or a lot deeper into both subjects. So you're going to really enjoy this chat. Like I said, it could easily have been number 100. I was delighted to get Eamonn on. I've been pestering him for probably 8 months now to try to get him on. But he found some time, which was great, and I really appreciate Eamonn taking the time to come on. So just before we get into the chat with Eamonn, just want to introduce you to Ethan at Coach Me Plus, and he's going to talk about drop sets, or down sets as they may be known, and how they can be used in strength training and not necessarily just in kind of bodybuilding training. So I hope you enjoy a little chat with Ethan, and I know you'll enjoy the chat with Eamonn. So enjoy, and I'll speak to you soon.
In this segment, I want to cover drop sets in weight training. Drop sets or down sets, whichever phrase or terminology you prefer to use. They're the same in my book. They've been used in training for a long time, in bodybuilding especially, but I've seen them have been utilized in strength training as well. In the strength training aspect, utilizing down sets is if you're strength training with moderate heavy fives, or you're doing heavy triples. Obviously, you are looking for maximal strength gains, so you're not going to accumulate as much volume as you would be in, say, a hypertrophy phase. If you're still looking to accumulate some volume because the central nervous system is just so taxed from all the strength training and the muscle fiber recruitment, you could utilize down sets as a way to accumulate some volume without accumulating a ton of fatigue in, say, the beginning of your workout. So, for example, if I'm squatting 3 sets of 5 at 100 kilos, and that's roughly, let's say, 90% of my best squat. I'll keep the math easy. Then you could use 2 or 3 down sets at, say, 75 or 80 kilos as a way to accumulate some volume, but still utilize some strength. So if I was doing 100 kilos at sets of 5 for 3 sets, I could then use 2 down sets at 75 to 80 kilos for sets of 5. So I get a little bit I still get strength training because I'm not going up in the high rep ranges of my sets, but I'm doing some extra volume with the drop sets. So I accumulate some volume, which allows me to target a little bit of hypertrophy work, but I'm still in the strength training realm. You could also utilize down sets for hypertrophy work. You could do, let's say, 3 sets of 8 at a strict press at 100 kilos, because 100 kilos is just easy math. If I'm doing 3 sets of 8, I could then drop down for 3 sets of 8 at 85 kilos or 70 or 75 or 85 to 75 kilos. So you accumulate more volume with the down sets, but you're not accumulating as much fatigue because you're not in your working sets. You can utilize those in your program, and they're a great way to add volume to the workout. Hope it helps.
To get your weekly dose of applied sports science updates, go to CoachMePlus.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. That's CoachMePlus.com.
Thanks for tuning in to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So tonight I have the absolute pleasure to speak with the lead S&C coach at the Irish Institute of Sport in Eamonn Flanagan. So welcome to the podcast, Eamonn.
Thanks, Rob. Pleasure to get to speak to you.
Absolutely. So pleasure to have you, mate. So anyone that doesn't know who you are, just want to give us a little bit of information on you and what you're doing down at the Institute.
So I suppose I've just started working at the Irish Institute of Sport in the last kind of 7 months or so. So I guess I've joined at an interesting time in that we're in the last kind of 6 to 8 months, lead into Rio. And mainly here we look after, the strength and conditioning, the physiology, the performance analysis, the physiotherapy, lifestyle skills, medical services to really the high performance focused sports within Ireland. And I work specifically in the strength and conditioning department. So I work across a number of different sports, but for the most part, at the Institute here, we work with, large athlete groups in athletics, Paralympics, boxing, and smaller athlete groups in badminton, swimming, triathlon, modern pentathlon. So my role here is a little bit of a mix of managing the strength and conditioning delivery across sports, some active coaching with certain athlete groups, a little bit of sports science support, a little bit of program management, that kind of thing, generally. And then I guess the path I've kind of taken to get here, over the last 10 years or so, I started out doing a sports and exercise science degree in the University of Limerick, and I kind of fairly shortly after that transitioned into a PhD program. I was pretty lucky to pick up some scholarship funding to do a master's to PhD transfer program, and I did my research on kind of stretch shortening cycle function, reactive strength, force production abilities in athletes who had previous ACL reconstruction and had been rehabilitating. And I guess since then I was lucky to do a year in my PhD program over in Northern Michigan University, where there was a US Olympic Education Center training facility for boxing, speed skating, weightlifting, and I got the opportunity to train there and learn with the weightlifting squad, and the head coach there, Ma Jianping, who was an Olympian for China in 1984 in the LA Games. And I think that's what I probably liked most about the PhD program. Really was the flexibility it offered a kind of a young sports scientist / S&C coach. The PhD program I found myself in afforded me a lot of flexibility to manage my own time when I tested, when I did my lit review, how I set my deadlines. And so it gave me a good opportunity to begin to build up that coaching experience as I went along. So I was getting to do little bits and pieces of volunteer work and part-time work in rowing, athletics, Gaelic games, club rugby, professional rugby. And like everybody else, as the PhD program, as my education program was kind of coming to an end, I was scrambling around looking for a full-time job, as we all do. Like most people, I had plenty of knockbacks. And then I got the opportunity to go to Scottish rugby over in Edinburgh, and I moved over there. I worked for a year in their national academy, and then I spent 3 absolutely fantastic years at Edinburgh Rugby. And about three and a half years ago, I moved back to Dublin in Ireland to work for the IRFU, and I worked with the IRFU with the national under-20s team and across the academy program. Our underage players on a national level. And then just before Christmas last year, I moved across. I made the move across to the Irish Institute of Sport, and so we're still based in Dublin here.
Interesting. So one thing that I don't want to drop this on you, and please feel free to kind of veto the question. But
yeah.
One thing that I'd seen on Twitter a little bit over the last couple of months really is a bit of not negative, but I suppose it is negative about the publishing process. And obviously someone that's gone through a PhD and is still obviously actively publishing research. What is your kind of thoughts about the whole process itself? Because there seem to be a lot of negatives about it. That was all.
Really good question. What do I think about that? I think when I was trying to write and publish as part of my PhD program, I didn't know any better to question the process. So I wrote my papers, my supervisor reviewed them, I got great critical feedback, I tied that into the paper, I sent it in for review, I got the reviewers' feedback, which at times may have been frustrating or I may have disagreed with, but I tried to take it as critical, constructive feedback, and I tried to improve whatever paper I might have been working on at the time. And so I think in theory, that process to me is great. It's a valuable process. I think the only observation I'd have more recently is I think the speed at which information is now disseminated through social media and online, I don't know if that's maybe negatively affecting the peer review process in a lot of ways, in the sense that, for example, if I submit a paper tomorrow, you see a lot of people do this. They submit a paper and then they send out a tweet that says, hey, just submitted my paper on, stretch shortening cycle performance in elite rugby players to the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. I'm pumped. Yeah. Let's say that. straight away, you've pretty much completely blown apart the whole concept of the blind reviewing process for starters. Right. So I think in a lot of ways, as frustrating as the peer review process might be, I think us researchers and us people who are active on social media, we've got to take a little bit of responsibility for it as well. But I think now, because it's so easy to spread data so effectively and so quickly, I can understand why that would make anybody quite frustrated with the peer review process. You do your research, you take a couple of weeks to do all the results, you take maybe a month to write the whole thing up, and it still might be 12 months, 18 months or 24 months before the thing actually comes to print. And it's almost, by definition, it's already outdated. So I can understand that frustration. I'd probably share that frustration, but unfortunately I can't think of a better alternative right now.
Okay. No, it was just something that, again, I'd probably read 10 minutes before we started talking. I just thought, I wonder what other people's take is on this. So, no, that's cool, mate. So I just want to get into the chat, and it kind of focuses around what your PhD was, which was kind of RSI stuff. But I just wanted you to touch on something that I'd spoke to Mark Jarvis about, who I think he's doing his PhD around the quantifying of plyos. So I was wondering if you could just get into a little bit of a chat around the difficulties and the obstacles that comes with when you want to do that.
Yeah, so I guess if we're talking about maybe quantifying plyometric training, I think for me there's probably two strands to that. And the first is probably, quantifying the mechanical or the neuromuscular intensity of exercises. So quantifying the stress of the jumping or the landing portion of plyometric exercise. And at a simple level, and I work fairly simply, I guess that's probably going to be dependent on, it's going to typically be determined by, I guess, the amount of force involved in the jumping or the landing phase, maybe the time in which that force is applied or that force is absorbed, and maybe the joints, the joints in the body across which that force is maybe dissipated or absorbed, and when we're doing our jumping activities. So I guess if we're thinking about different jumping activities, something like a counter movement jump, a standard vertical jump, in that activity, we might produce a reasonably large total amount of force, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a high intensity exercise. We might produce a lot of force, we might jump with maximal intensity of effort, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a high intensity plyometric exercise, because we're applying that force over quite a long time period. It might be 0.5 or 0.6 of a second. And also we're generating or absorbing that force across, multiple joints. The knee and the hip and the ankle are all contributing pretty extensively to absorbing the force on landing or generating the force on jumping. So if you counter that to, your faster plyometric activities like your repeat hurdle jumps with short contact times, or your drop jumps, or your pogo hops, there, you've still got reasonably high forces produced, but those forces are now produced or absorbed in very, very, very short time periods. And those activities might be a lot more single joint dominant, might be a lot more ankle dominant. So all of a sudden you've got similar amounts of force applied, more localized to certain joints in much quicker time periods, which probably makes them have a much greater stress on muscle connective tissue and the joints involved. So I think that's a challenge as a coach, is to weigh up what is the relative intensity of the different jumping or plyometric exercises I'm going to use. The second strand to that, I guess, is more of a training transfer question, and it's what is the type or the nature of the plyometric exercise that you're doing, and I guess that's where maybe in some of the stuff I've written or talked about, I've talked a little bit about, the slow stretch shortening cycle or the fast stretch shortening cycle, and they're certainly not terms that I coined or came up with in any way. I've just happened to have kind of researched them a little bit and written about them a little bit. So for me, I guess that the main point there is that not all jumping exercises are created equal. I think a mistake I've certainly made in the past, and maybe some younger or less experienced S&C coaches make, is that we tend to kind of lump all jumping related activities in together and term them generically plyometric training. But ultimately, there's probably two very different types of plyometric activity. You've got your more kind of vertical jump height focused training, which is, is more physiologically, is maybe more slow stretch shortening cycle. It tends to be very hip and knee dominant, tends to have very long contraction times, tends to be very jump height focused. And then at the opposite side of that coin, you've maybe got, your fast ground contact focus exercises, what we call fast stretch shortening cycle exercises, and they typically have much less flexion at the knee and the hip, typically have very short contraction times, or they involve a distinct ground contact phase that's very short in duration, and they tend to be much more ankle dominant, and again they tend to be, I think, much higher intensity plyometric exercises. And if we looked at those fast stretch shortening cycle plyometrics, at one end of the spectrum there, you'd probably have the type of simple skipping and pogo hopping type drills we would do in track training or in warm-up work for the gym. And at the other end of that spectrum, you'd have, I guess, the more traditional Russian shock training methods, where you use very high dropping heights in the drop jump, and you're looking at very intense plyometric exercises that are focused on really quite general physiologic adaptation around, the neuromuscular system and the Golgi tendon organs and things like that. And so again, I think in terms of quantifying, you got to think about what's the relative intensity of the plyometric or the jump training in terms of the stress on the muscle and the connective tissue and the joints. And then I think you've got to think about what's the nature or the type of exercise you're using in terms of wanting to transfer that training to sport. Because I think beyond very early general training phases in relatively untrained athletes, I suspect there's probably very limited transfer between your slow and your fast stretch shortening cycle activity. So you can do all the counter movement jumps you want. You can do, as much box jumps as you want. But beyond an initial general training effect, I don't suspect that's going to have much of a positive effect on, the integrity of your foot contact or your fast force application in high speed running.
You just answered my next question, which was about the transfer of the slow and fast stretch shortening cycle activities. So the slow stretch shortening activities would be maybe for general prep stuff and for younger athletes or less well trained athletes.
I think they both can have a place.
Okay.
I think that's maybe something that I would challenge a little bit. I think both types can have a place in general prep phases and with novice or beginner athletes. I just think with, so in the case of your slow stretch shortening cycle stuff, with those novice athletes, you're maybe spending a little bit more time working on the actual mechanics of their jumping and the mechanics of their landing rather than the actual height that they're jumping to. And in terms of the faster activities, the ground contact focused activities, I think they should still be in, novice training programs. Ultimately, those novice athletes, they're still sprinting, they're still hopping and skipping as part of their on-field work or track work or whatever. So I would still include fast stretch shortening cycle activities for them. But, your focus might be a little bit more on lower intensity options where the athlete can focus on, good foot integrity, good foot contact, short contact times, but there's very little focus on, again, the contact times and the jump height, which makes the whole exercise a lot more intense. But so I think the slow and the fast will have different transfer effects. for sure. I think one is going to, the slow activities or the jump height focus activities are obviously going to have a little bit more of a direct effect on jump height outcomes, and your faster activities are going to have a little bit more of an effect on your activities which are more dependent on fast contact times, ankle dominance, and fast force production.
Mm-hmm. Which brings me on nicely to a couple of, 3 articles that you wrote for Train with Push about RSI. Do you just want to talk to us a little bit about, it's probably going to touch on what you actually spoke about in the articles. And again, I mean, you talk about you've been talking simply. Please drag it down to my level, and just maybe talk to us a little bit about maybe what you talked about in the first RSI article and actually what it is and kind of where it fits in.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I guess what we talked about already was, how you might quantify the intensity of your plyometric work. And, you mentioned people there who might be doing PhD work in this area. And I think to quantify those plyometric exercises very precisely, you've got to be looking at the video, you've got to be looking at the joint angles, you've got to be using your force plates. If you really want to nail down what the true intensity of those exercises are. Ultimately, not many of us have access to those tools in the practical domain that we work in. So I think in that instance, I think it's not a perfect fit, but the reactive strength index can be a simple objective tool to guide us towards kind of optimizing that fast stretch shortening cycle training, or to guide us or to help us understand the intensity of our plyometric work. So all the reactive strength index is, it's a simple measure that you would use in drop jumps or hurdle jumps or hurdle hops, repeated pogo hops, and it looks at how high you jump divided by your ground contact time. So if I was doing a drop jump and I got off the ground in 150 milliseconds and I jumped 30 centimeters, I'd divide the jump height by the contact time and I'd get a reactive strength score of 2 arbitrary units, or 2 meters per second. So that's kind of how you would calculate it. And I guess now the ability or the possibilities of measuring that within your training is becoming much more widely available. You can do it with, a jump mat that might cost you a few hundred quid. You can do it with timing systems like OptoJump, which are a little bit more expensive, but very accurate, very reliable. And now you can potentially do it with wearable technology like the push band, which is beginning to incorporate things like the reactive strength index into some of its protocols. So that's kind of what it is. And I guess, why I like it is that it's giving you that little bit of information about how high you're jumping, how fast you're jumping, and the trade-off between the two. And it's been shown to be a reasonably reliable and a reasonably kind of sensitive measure. So once you can measure it, it allows you, if you want to optimize your plyometric training, it allows you to potentially play around with different box heights in your drop jumps to possibly identify heights that may be a little bit too low or a little bit too high for the athlete, because you're seeing their reactive strength scores, drop off a cliff. Over time, it's potentially a tool you could use to identify your athlete's chronic adaptation to a plyometric training program that you might be implementing. And I know we'll talk maybe a little bit later about how you could potentially use it as a monitoring tool or a readiness to train tool as well.
So one thing when we were back and forth with the kind of stuff that we're going to chat about, you mentioned about single leg testing options, and that's something that often gets asked of you when it comes to this kind of thing. So I just want to touch on, maybe answer them questions.
I kind of forgot you were going to ask me that. So the simple answer to that is I don't have a good answer to that question. So I think for the most part, what we've been talking about so far has been your slow and your fast stretch shortening exercises, and they've been exercises like counter movement jumps, box jumps. They've been exercises like drop jumps, repeat hops on the spot like pogo hops. And obviously all those exercises I've mentioned, they're all bilateral, they're all vertical force production. And we know that obviously so much of the activity we do is a little bit more horizontally focused, or can be a bit more horizontally focused, and obviously any locomotion we do is very much single leg focused. So naturally the question then is, well, do we need to be testing reactive strength more horizontally, or do we need to be testing it in a single leg condition? And I think that the simple answer to those two questions is yeah, ideally, it'd be nice to look at this both vertically and horizontally and both bilaterally and in the single leg option. But I can't. I can sit here and tell you some simple and effective ways to test vertical bilateral reactive strength, and I've outlined a lot of those in the Train with Push article series. But I probably can't sit here and tell you I've got a gold standard for the single leg horizontal focused reactive strength testing. I think the general trade-off with double versus single leg activity is going to be that, there's always going to be a trade-off when we're measuring anything. There's always going to be a trade-off, I think, between experimental control and training or testing specificity. So obviously with something like a vertical drop jump, we've got really good control. We can control the box height really well. Athletes tend to be able to get the technique of the exercise pretty quickly, and the results we get tend to be, fairly tightly clustered together. Your variability from rep to rep is within probably 5%. So what we have there is we've got really good experimental control, but potentially we've got a little bit lower specificity. If you're looking for that horizontal single leg option, now we're pushing more towards that specificity side of things. But from my experience, once you go to that single leg option, the reliability gets a little bit noisier, the data gets a little bit harder to collect, and so I think you lose a little bit of that experimental control when you get after the specificity. But that doesn't, just because we can't measure it as well as we can measure the general training, doesn't mean that that's not an avenue that's worth exploring. And I know there's a lot of good researchers out there doing more work in that area than I am. And I think James Wild, for example, who you've had in the podcast before, I think he's doing some pretty good work in that area. So he might be the one who really nails down a nice, robust, horizontal, single leg reactive strength test. And that's me firmly passing the buck to somebody else there.
Yeah, passing the buck to a fellow ginger for me. Yeah. He was great. Yeah, it was great to have on was James. So just about, you touched on it and said we'll talk about it in a while. So I'll kind of bring it back to the daily monitoring, and maybe this goes into probably touching on parts 2 and 3 for the RSI articles. But it was just where does RSI fit into the bigger daily monitoring in picture for people?
Yeah, so I guess, like I said already, I think there's 3 simple applications to using the reactive strength index. And one is just using it acutely to try and optimize the plyometric intensity of your exercise, changing the box height on your drop jumps, as an example. The other way is, maybe using it as a quarterly or monthly or weekly test to look at the chronic adaptation to plyometric training and the chronic adaptation to reactive strength training. But you could potentially use that same data as a daily or as a weekly readiness to train type metric. So the obvious question there is, why would you use something like the reactive strength index rather than the counter movement jump, which I think if we were having this conversation 5 or 6 years ago, I think more people were probably using a standard counter movement jump for height as their weekly monitoring tool. And I guess when you're using something as simple as a jump height, which is output focused only, you potentially miss part of the picture when fatigue gets involved. So Stuart Cormack, for example, did incredible work in this area. Back in, I think, 2007, 2008, around that time in AFL, and he looked at different jump tests across an entire AFL season. And I think what he showed pretty clearly was that if you just look at jump height, athletes can potentially recruit different jump strategies to maintain the same jump height over time. So if I'm under fatigue, if I usually jump 50 centimeters in a counter movement jump and I'm under fatigue, I'll find a way to still jump 48 or 49 centimeters, maybe even 50 centimeters, but I might spend longer in the eccentric phase. I might spend longer in the transition phase from eccentric to concentric. I might go through greater hip and knee flexion in order to generate the force I need to jump 48, 49, 50 centimeters. And I think what Stuart Cormack did was he continued using the counter movement jump, but I guess using a force plate, he was able to look at how does that jump height relate to the time it takes me to produce the jump. So, how long does it take me to go through the eccentric and concentric phase? That's basically my contact time and my contraction time. And how does that relate to the jump height I jumped to? And he found that was a much more sensitive measure to fatigue over, an arduous week-on-week season. And so that's where the reactive strength index potentially adds some value as a marker of neuromuscular fatigue. It's not just looking at jump height, it's looking at the contact time as well, and it's looking at them in relation to each other. So, again, if I'm on my good days, if I'm jumping 30 centimeters and I'm getting off the ground in 150 milliseconds, as I go through a period of the season, I become fatigued. I may maintain that jump height at 30 centimeters, but my contact time might creep out to 160 milliseconds, 170 milliseconds, 190 milliseconds. So we'll see quite a noticeable, measurable difference in the reactive strength index on that basis, because I'm maintaining jump height, but I'm doing it in a different way. I'm recruiting a different strategy to achieve the same outcome. So I think because of that, the reactive strength index is potentially a more sensitive tool to try and assess that fitness fatigue model when we're looking at our athletes.
So is there specific thresholds that you would say is not thresholds, but say take the example of the 30 centimeter jump and 150 milliseconds. At what point are you changing things in the up and coming training session? Are you letting it go to 0.1 or what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would probably say here that I wouldn't sit here and tell you I would set a percentage cutoff point for somebody's program intervention. I think the way I would try and look to do that type of work is to really take every athlete as an individual. So every athlete's going to have different amounts of variability from trial to trial. So, I might, have 2% variability on my 3 drop jump tests. Another athlete might have 6% variability. And that just might be our usual variability. So I think the best approach is, you're certainly going to need a group of athletes who are familiar with fast plyometric training, who are familiar with drop jumps and have had a habituation period. And you probably are going to need to have that habituation period be a number of weeks, a number of testing sessions. But, it can be worked into warm-up type activities or general readiness to train type activities. And then I think after that, you're really looking at establishing each individual's baseline, knowing what their kind of normal variation is from rep to rep or from week to week, and then using that data, I guess, to set individual thresholds, using something like a smallest worthwhile change or an effect size type approach that might give you the option of having your green, amber, red traffic light system. So if I was to work with a group right now, the general standard I'd probably use might be, looking at a moderate effect size, which tends to be 0.6 of a standard deviation. That might be like my amber zone, where I'm going to pay a little bit of attention to the decline in performance. And, a standard deviation or a 1.2 standard deviations, a large effect size, that's probably what I'm going to have as my red flag. So when that athlete is, a full standard deviation below, the baseline we've established, that's maybe where we're looking at possibly having some kind of intervention. But, we spoke a little bit previously, Rob, about, for me, you got to have your baselines, you got to establish individual thresholds. But for me, the biggest part of the monitoring process, whether it's RSI or any monitoring tool we use, for me, it's the context, and the context, specifically the context of that individual athlete. And I guess what I mean by that is, as S&C coaches now, we're in this era of big data. If you take something like, I don't know, I guess, the simplest monitoring tool we've got is probably training time and RPE to give us a training load. Simplest, most widely available, cheapest tool we've got. And if you even just take that tool alone, out of those two numbers, our training time and our RPE, we can get training load, training monotony, training strain. We can get the training stress balance that Tim Gavitt's published a lot on. We can get, weekly change in terms of percentages. We can get a percentage breakdown of how much training load we've spent in S&C, sport specific, speed, conditioning, etc. Even just that simple method can bombard us with information. So, and then that's not to mention before we get into musculoskeletal screens, reactive strength testing, HRV, GPS, whatever monitoring tools we're using. So I think for me, context is really important. And the context for me is framed by an understanding for each of our athletes of what the big established kind of risk factors are. So we know reasonably strongly that, stronger athletes are going to recover a little bit quicker from game to game. Tim Gavitt's done some work in that area. We know that athletes who are better conditioned are going to recover more effectively from game to game and will tolerate the demands of training more effectively. We know that strength has a protective effect in terms of injury. We know that, injury history is probably one of the best predictive factors around future injury. A lot of the work that's been done by UEFA on their big epidemiological studies in football would show us that, we know when there's short time periods from game to game, or players' game time is poorly managed and they accumulate quite a lot of game time acutely, we know that that's an injury risk factor. And I think most of us working in strength and conditioning would also probably know intuitively or through experience that those athletes with their really explosive, fast twitch, speed profiles, we know that they tend to need a little bit more managing and tend to be a little bit more exposed to acute injury incidences as well. So I told you I'd go off on a tangent, so here it is. For me, I guess the point is I would always look at those factors first. So I'd look at my athletes, especially in the team sport environment where you might be managing 30, 35, even 50 athletes week on week. And I'd try and identify who are the ones who are strong, who are the ones who are well conditioned or poorly conditioned, who are the explosive guys, who are the workhorses, who are the guys with extensive injury histories, who are not. And that for me would inform any decision I'm making on something like my monitoring tests or my reactive strength tests week on week. If I've got a guy who's really strong, very well conditioned, keeps himself in good condition, has a very clean injury history, if I've got a guy like that and he's in that red zone for reactive strength index, I'm going to be much less inclined to make any intervention. Because for me, that athlete over time, the whole point of him doing all that training, the whole point of him getting stronger, getting more fit, keeping himself lean, keeping himself fit and healthy, the whole point of that 10 years that he's put in is so that he can get through these periods of fatigue relatively unscathed. If I'm dealing with a guy who's, not as strong compared to his peers, especially in a contact sport, who's not well conditioned, but who may still be very explosive, who maybe has an extensive injury history, when I'm seeing those red flags in the wellness scores or the reactive strength testing or the training load or the training stress balance metrics, that's where I'm probably going to be a lot more likely to intervene or to go to the head coach and try and promote an intervention in that case. I guess for me, it's a little bit like, if we're not looking at those big risk factors first, it's a bit like trying to look for, advanced screens for coronary heart disease before you've even asked the patient whether they smoke or not, Yeah. I just think we've got to take the big picture into account and use that to inform how we action the monitoring data.
Just going to take a short break in the middle of the chat with Eamonn. In part 2, you can look forward to Eamonn chatting about velocity-based training and where that fits into his program, and a lot of views from Eamonn on that. So massive thanks to Coach Me Plus for providing the little segment at the start of the episode and for sponsoring the episode today. And massive thanks to Val Performance, makers of the Nord board, for also sponsoring the episode today. So as we mentioned in part 1 with Eamonn, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to catch up with the RSI articles that Eamonn did for Train with Push. So if you go to trainwithpush.com and just visit the blog, all Eamonn's articles are up there. So hope you enjoyed part 1 and hope you do enjoy part 2. I'm sure you will, and we'll catch up soon. Enjoy. So I just want to move on a little bit, and I know you don't want to be known as the velocity-based training guy, but we'll have to touch on it. So,
sure, yeah.
Obviously, it's an area that you're familiar with, but do you just want to give us a brief overview of maybe where you use it with your athletes, and where it might kind of fit into the more global training environment?
Yeah. Good question. So where would I use it? When would I use it? Yeah, I guess, I mean, at different times I've used velocity-based training more than others. There's been many environments in which I've barely used it at all, and there's been some environments where I've used it a lot, and some athletes where I'll use it sparingly. So I guess, first of all, I think it's useful to give you the examples of where I wouldn't use it. So instances of where I wouldn't be too interested or feel like there's much need to use velocity-based training or velocity measurement devices would be, I guess, with novice athletes. So I'm working with an athlete who doesn't have particularly robust patterns in the weight room. Well, then I'm not inclined to put the velocity measurement on and ask them to give me big outputs. I'll spend the time working with them face to face, improving those patterns, getting them, hopefully getting them to be able to tolerate, consistent loading week on week. So that's one instance of where I wouldn't use it. I wouldn't use it where the coaching athlete ratio isn't good. So, if I'm in when I work with the Irish under 20s, often you might be in the weight room and the ratios, 12 to 1, 14 to 1, or, 16 to 2 or whatever. So in that kind of environment, I'm going to want to spend as little time with my head down in an iPad as possible. So in that environment, a couple of the more experienced guys might be using the technology themselves, and I might give them a little guidance on that. But for the most part, I'm not using it. I'm keeping my eyes up and I'm trying to look at what the guys are doing and keep an eye on them much more qualitatively, much more technically in the build up to a test match, let's say. That's where I wouldn't use it. I'd also be much less inclined to use it with new athletes. They could be experienced athletes, but if I haven't already, watched them train for a significant amount of time and don't have a good appreciation for how they move, how they train, I haven't built up much rapport with them, then I'll try and not use it very much, because again, it's maybe a distraction and it's going to detract from what I'm seeing with my eyes and the relationship and development with those athletes. But obviously, that's not to say that there aren't terrific applications for the technology. And like we said about reactive strength measurements, the technology is more available than it's ever been, with different suppliers and different price points. So I think how I would use it would very much vary from athlete to athlete. So we talked a little bit about reactive strength testing before, and reactive strength testing is maybe useful because it's not just giving you an output of jump height, but it's also giving you information on how you do the jump, contact time. So if I'm working with Paralympic athletes, maybe a wheelchair racer, for example, or a wheelchair-based shot putter, for example, obviously that reactive strength testing isn't gonna be an option, but velocity-based training is potentially giving us something just as useful. So we might pick a fixed load in a bench press or a fixed load in a bench throw. We might test that light fixed load week on week, and we're getting a velocity measurement there, which, just like the reactive strength index, ultimately velocity is a distance divided by a time. So with those athletes, I might use it as a weekly monitor, just like we might use reactive strength, but that might be the only time I use it with some athletes. I like the idea of using it to maybe add depth to our strength testing. So in the past, I've probably been a big 1 rep max testing guy. I still think there's a place for it. I still think there's a place for 1 rep max testing. It obviously has its downsides. And I think more and more velocity-based training really offers us a lot more of a chance to look at an athlete's profile without even taking them close to a 1 rep max lift. So we can see what they're doing at 40% 1RM, 60% 1RM, and 80% 1RM. And it'll give us a little bit of an insight into, especially amongst a bigger group, who are the guys who are producing high speeds at low loads, who are the guys who are producing, low speeds at higher loads, and maybe give us a little bit of an insight into our training groups as to where we might want to look at maximal strength development and where we might want to look at a little bit more of a velocity focused. And in some cases, I haven't used this method a huge amount, but in some cases, it's a nice tool to use to limit the fatigue effects in our training or to find that optimal training zone. So, the relationship between load and velocity, it's very robust, very strong relationship. So on a given day, I might be able to back squat. I can't, but let's say I could back squat 200 kilos. On a day when I'm super fresh, super fit, super pumped, I might come into the gym and I might give you that 200 kilos, and you can program, my 80% load, my 90% load off the back of that. But in our, in any of our sports, there are so many other stressors outside of the the weight room. On a given day, I might come in and the most I can give you is 160 kilos. So if you're prescribing me to lift 5 sets of 5 at 80%, all of a sudden on that day, in that moment, you may be asking me to actually do 5 sets of 5 at 100%. So if we have a bit of a profile on our athletes and we know the velocity zones which equate to the relative percentage of load on a given day, we can be a little bit more flexible in the weight room, and we can say, hey, look, I want you to do 5 sets of 5. I want you to roughly work in this velocity zone, let's say 0.8 to 0.6 meters per second. You can go as heavy as you want, as long as none of your reps are below 0.6 meters per second. And that's not a bad way to ensure that the athlete is working in, let's say, that 80% zone on that day. On another day, that 80% zone might look very different if they're fresher, more psychologically kind of ready for the session, etc. But overall, look, I think overall, I would say the simplest application for velocity-based training is also probably the most effective, and that's just simply giving athletes feedback as a tool to drive their output. So you don't need to do any clever maths. You don't need to have any kind of complicated spreadsheets. If you're just giving the athlete their scores, you're telling them how fast they're moving the bar in a session where you really want them to have a high intent of effort on each repetition, that for me is probably the best outcome. So if we're in a, potentially a speed strength phase, or you're doing ballistic work that's very much targeting high intensity of effort, high speed of movement, or just high intent of movement, that to me is the simplest and the most effective application. Give athletes feedback, give two athletes training alongside each other feedback, have them compete against each other, have them compete against themselves, and you're going to get the athlete is going to get a better intensity of effort from rep to rep, and we would expect that we're going to get a better training effect because of that higher intensity of effort.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to using the push for RSI, what's the validity and reliability of that compared to something like an Optojump? And just to make everyone aware that you're not an ambassador for any of these products that we mentioned, so
no,
just get that out of the way.
Yeah, I mean, that's not something. So we've got a paper in press at the moment with the University of Limerick where we've looked a little bit at the reliability of the push device versus what we'd hope is a gold standard in 3D motion capture. And I think generally there, and that's just in bench press activity, and generally there, the picture for something like a piece of wearable technology, picture is generally a good one. It's it describes the relationships between load and velocity that we would expect to see, but it's a little noisier than the gold standard. It's maybe a little noisier than some of the linear position transducers, but is it good enough to give you what you need? I think it probably is. And is it good enough considering the price point? I think it probably is. Obviously, the counter movement jump stuff and the reactive strength stuff has come online a little bit more recently. I can't say that I've looked at that in any really robust empirical manner, but I have taken a little bit of a look at it, and I think I've seen enough to think that it's promising. But if I was using both right now, I'd be using Optojump because it's measuring the contact time and the jump height directly rather than integrating it from accelerometry based data. But I've seen enough to think that it's pretty promising, and as long as you nail down your protocol pretty tightly, I think you're probably going to get some reasonably meaningful, reasonably actionable data. Will it be right now? Is it precise enough to make those acute training adjustments we're talking about from week to week? I'm not sure. Is it enough to give you a guide on how an athlete's adapting over longer periods of time when you've got more data points and you can smooth out the noise a little bit? I think it's probably got some value to add there for sure. One thing that's probably worth mentioning there that we've talked a lot about using the reactive strength index in drop jumps, and that I think is what's traditionally been done with the reactive strength index. But the protocol on the push device is actually repeat pogo hops. So repeat vertical hops with short contact times. And that's something I have used pretty extensively with timing gates, Optojump type system, not with push. But I should say here that I really like that protocol. I think that protocol is very intuitive for athletes. Most of them get it, can pick it up very quickly. I think your habituation period is shorter. So that's a big plus. One of the challenges with, if you're not using a force plate, if you're just using a jump mat, one of the challenges with Reactive Strength Index is the jump height is calculated from the flight time. And the flight time can be manipulated by, tucking the feet up on landing. So you don't land with the legs towards extension. You kind of tuck a little bit and you get a few extra milliseconds on your flight time, which gives you a couple of % on your jump height. And that's kind of hard to police, even with really good habituation, really good eyes-on coaching and strict coaching. It's hard to police, and it's hard to see those tiny percentages that athletes might consciously or subconsciously cheat a little bit. And I think why I like the pogo hop protocol is because it's a hopping based protocol. You have to have your legs towards extension on every landing, otherwise you won't be able to hop effectively. So I think it standardizes that a little bit, and it takes the onus off you as a coach having to watch every rep exactly and be really strict on the landing. So a little bit of an aside, but I think the protocol that's built into that push system, I think it's a pretty nice protocol. And if anybody had jump mat, up to jump, push, whatever they've got, I think it's worthwhile to experiment with a repeat hop protocol, because I think it can give a lot of value in terms of monitoring that reactive strength.
So is there a specific demographic that you would split between the two? You do one with the drop jump and one with the one that they use with the push band, the repeated hops?
I think in terms of a weekly, if we're talking about using reactive strength as a weekly monitor, a readiness to train type monitor, I would just pick the test that I felt best suited the population based on where we're testing, what their training looks like, what they're kind of habituated to. So if they're not doing any drop jumps in their training, then I'd probably do the pogo hop type stuff. If they're really used to doing drop jumps, I'd probably do the drop jumps. If I'm traveling away with a team, I'm probably going to do the pogo hops because I don't want to have to bring a 30 centimeter box with me. So, there's those kind of practicalities you got to think about. If you're talking about just using reactive strength testing generally, it depends what the goal is. So again, if we want to optimize the drop jump training process, well, then obviously I'm using drop jumps. If I'm just looking to give an athlete some feedback on, vertical pogo hops or horizontal pogo hops, if we've got enough up to jump to do that, then I'm going to use those exercises. So I guess it depends on what the training or what the testing outcome is and what the practicalities around that look like.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just conscious of time, but I know you mentioned a paper under review. Have you got any other research in the pipeline?
I think the simple answer to that is probably no.
Okay, cool.
No, not particularly. I think I've been lucky enough to be asked to speak at the United States Olympic Committee High Performance Symposium next year, May 2017. So I think I'm hoping between now and then to push on a lot of the reactive strength work. I don't know what that looks like just now, but I'm hoping to push that work on maybe between now and then, and maybe just really get into a couple of different areas in that kind of space, particularly around, I guess, our understanding of reactive strength, but also our understanding of maybe the relationship between pure maximal reactive strength and maybe our reactive strength endurance. So I'm not sure if I'll get this type of research done, but an area I'd love to sort of explore a little bit is what is the relationship between those two things. Because reactive strength is so measurable, I think in the strength and conditioning field, we tend to, sometimes we can push those numbers a little bit too aggressively because they're measurable and we can see them change on a spreadsheet. But I think what we don't really know at the moment, and there's a lot we don't know about plyometric training, and there's a lot we don't know about the reactive strength quality. And so what I think we really don't know at the moment is, how much reactive strength is enough. So if you think about sports like maybe boxing as an example, maybe 400-meter running, for example, at some point, is more reactive strength beyond a certain threshold, is it actually going to enhance our performance? Or is it a lot more important, how well we can maintain a sub-maximal level of reactive strength for, let's say, effective footwork at the end of a third 3-minute round? So I don't know the answers to those questions, but I think, as practitioners, we should always be kind of critically assessing the demands of the sports we're working in, the qualities of the athlete, and trying to identify, is it actually, do we need to keep pushing the pure maximal reactive strength qualities of this athlete? Or is it more a reactive strength endurance quality that maybe we need to look at in this athlete? So that's something I'd love to dip into between now and next year, but I have absolutely no idea if that'll happen or not.
Is this the symposium that's the invite only one? Is that the same one? We're talking about the same.
Yeah, so I think it's the one that Tim Hello, who you've had on the podcast, is organizing. Yeah,
the big time one.
I don't think it's invite only.
Okay,
but I think there might be maybe a vetting system of some kind. Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
you've got invited to the big time one.
Yeah, I have. I've gotten very lucky. Yeah, I've gotten very lucky. So I'll get a little trip to Colorado next year. So I'm very much looking forward to that, and it's a chance to plug the symposium for Tim as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know he's keen to get the word out there and get as many people working in high performance sport applying for that to attend that symposium as possible.
Nice, brilliant. So where can people keep up to date with what you've got going on, research wise, social media wise, Colorado wise?
I think Twitter is probably the best bet. My Twitter handle is at Eamonn Flanagan, and I'm pretty active there. So I think anybody who wants to get in touch, that's probably the best way to do it. I'm not particularly active on any other forms of social media, so that's the best way I think to keep in touch.
Cool. And you've got a ResearchGate page with your stuff on there as well? I do.
Yeah, I do. Yes, that should be pretty easy to find, I think, if you search for my name.
Yeah, I've been stalking you, so if you just put your name in, it all comes up.
Yeah, you just got to spell the name right, which might be a challenge for some of your listeners, but there you go.
No, that's cool, mate. Well, I ran up there because I've kept you for not far off an hour now. So really appreciate your time and really glad we got to line this up and have a chat.
Thanks very much, Rob. No, I was excited to. I know it took a while to come together, but very excited to speak to you. And the podcast is a really good resource for people. So thanks to you for keeping it going and getting so many good people to talk to you.
Absolute pleasure. The money's in the post. The money's in the post.
Good man.
Thanks, mate.
See you, Rob.
Speak soon. Bye. Thanks a lot for tuning in and listening to episode 99 of the Pacey Performance Podcast with Eamonn Flanagan. So, big build-up for me to number 100, so a bit of a landmark to get the podcast there. So I'm sure you'll tune in and see what's going to go down in episode 100. So just before I let you go, massive thanks to Coach Me Plus and Vald Performance for sponsoring the episode today, and thank you to you for your continued support of the podcast. So I will leave you and look forward to speaking to you in episode 100.